for today, the presentation will just be going over these different sections of the grid component, the different properties that you guys can take advantage of. So we'll go ahead and get started with what is required. So for a grid component to work, you need to have both the columns and the rows. The columns props, it's just an array of JSON objects with the name and the title as the most the required properties. And then optionally you can add a type. And in terms of the types, you can specify a currency, a number, or a date. So let's see an example of the columns prop. So for example, you have the age, which is specified as a type number. And what it's going to do is that for that number, it'll right align that data. Same thing goes for a currency type. So let's say that we have balance. Balance will also be right aligned. And we have insert date, type date, and which optionally you have formatting that you can assign as well. But enough of the description. It's easier to just to see this in the code. So let's go ahead and do that. So right here, we'll go ahead and add our grid component. And within the grid component, as you can already see, the columns and the rows are already imported for us. So for the columns, we'll go ahead and specify the same ones from the example. So with these other columns, let's say we have the person's age, which will be the number. We have an insert update date, which will provide a type date. And for update date, we want it to be formatted where we can see the month, date, and year, as well as the time it was added, just for the sake of the example. And then for balance, we have the type currency. So now with the data, let's go ahead and add the rows. And rows is an array of JSON objects. So we'll go ahead and populate that. So as you can see, for each of the columns, we have the name, which is essentially the ID of the column. And then we have the column title. And if you look at the rows, each one of the properties for the rows for each of the object corresponds to the ID of the column that we want to target with that data. So now that we have that, we'll go ahead and save it. And as you can see, our grid component is now rendered with the user ID data available. You have our name, age, insert date, and then the update date, which follows this same format that we specified in as part of the type for that column. Also, balance is in there. And as you can see with our data, the balance is simply a double, but then since we specified it as a currency, it adds the $sign and it right aligns it within our grid. And the same thing went for our age. Because we specified it as a number, it right aligned it here. So those are the basic setup of a grid component. Let's move on to the next section, which is the column formatting. So now let's say that, as you can see in here, that some of these are just way too wide. We want to go ahead and compress it so that it looks more compact. We can take advantage of this property called columnWidths. And what columnWidths needs is a JSON object where each key corresponds to the column name or the ID of that column. So as you can see in this example, we provide the column name and then we just provide some value. And any time that we don't provide the column name, the grid component will just assume that it's 180. So as you can see here, all of these are taking up 180 since we don't have it specified. So let's go ahead and change that. So control space, we can see that we can add the column widths, add object, and then let's say that the user ID, we want to make it smaller, make that 80. Want the name to also be smaller, age, insert date 150, and then balance is 100. So you'll notice that I didn't include the update date. What it will do then is assume that update date will be 180. And we don't have to specify because GridComponent will fill that in for us. So now if we go ahead and save, you can see that now our grid is more compressed. Next step is column reordering. By default, it's set to false, but you can allow the users to reorder the columns. Say we want to go ahead and allow column reorder and set that to true. They can now reorder all of these columns. But by default, if we don't provide that, the user can't reorder these columns. The next thing you can also do with the columns is hiding them and using the hiddenColumns prop. The hiddenColumns prop is simply an array of string values where you provide the column's name property. So as you can see right here. So let's say you don't want to show the user ID into the grid. We can go ahead and add that property, which is an array of string. And we want to target that user ID. So if we go ahead and click save, you can see that the user ID disappeared. If I get rid of that, you'll see that it's going to come back and then get hidden. And just an additional example, let's say we want to hide the insert date as well. You can see that it's not there anymore. So that's how you can hide columns. The next thing that you may encounter is setting up a tree data. So the way it works is you just specify the isTreeData property, which is just a Boolean true or false. And of course, by default, it's set to false. And all it's going to do is the grid component is going to look within the rows property for anything that has the children prop. And within that children, which is an array of objects, it's going to nest it under that row. So for this order number, all of these children will show up underneath it. So let's go ahead and look at an example of how this is going to appear. We'll use the example that was provided from the wiki. So as you can see here, we have our columns, order number, order date. We have our rows, which has the keys corresponding to those columns. And then we also have the children. So within the children, we have all of these additional objects. So besides providing the columns and the rows, all that's required for the tree data is to specify isTreeData and set it to true. So now if we go ahead and save it, you can see right here that we only see these two, which are the parent, like these, and their children that are nested under that row, this. As you can see, item ID 105,356, 105,356, apples, oranges. Those are all nested under this parent row. Same thing goes for this one right here underneath. So that's how you go about presenting tree data in the grid component. The next step is the row formatting. So let's say we want to present row details within each row. All that's required are two things. We have to specify the allowRowDetail prop, which is just a Boolean true or false. And by default, it's set to false. We also want to specify the rowDetailContent, which is how we want to render what appears underneath the row that the user expands. So in this example, if the user expands a certain row, then it's gonna show this summary where the information within that row gets divided up with its properties, and then it just gets displayed with this div. So let's say we want to go ahead and show that. Use the example. So we're using almost the same example as before, except now we don't have any of the children since it's not a tree. So we still have the order number, order date, customer name, and we have the rows. And what we want to do is we want to allow the row detail and set that to true. And then within the row detail content, we're going to be passed in this row object. And within that row, we can take apart all of the columns that the object will provide, and then return whatever we want to return as the rendered underneath it. So if we go ahead and save it, as you can see here, if we expand it, we can view the row details, which is this div, which has the customer name, the purchase item name, which is there. So that's just how you render the details, the row details. So the next step is the table cell formatting, which comes in handy if you want to make certain table cells clickable, or you want to style it a different way, or let's say you want to render something completely different other than the value, you can take advantage of that using the tableCellConfig. And the tableCellConfig is a JSON object whose keys correspond to the column's name property. So as you can see here, we have item name, which is the key of one of the columns, and an item name dropdown key of one of the columns as well. And the values are a JSON object with the following properties, which are the ones you can customize. So on click, so when you click on a table cell, it's gonna fire this callback function that you put inside of it. You can also specify the style. So whatever the styling the value will have. So in this example, it makes it so that it's color blue and so that it appears like it's clickable. The cursor will change to a pointer. Decoration will be underlined. And then lastly, the rendered component as well. So if for some reason you want to completely replace what is rendered, so rather than showing a value, you want to render a pop-up, you can go ahead and do that as well. Let's see an example of this tableCellConfig. Now let's say we want to make order number into something that's clickable. And the way we do that is we specify the tableCellConfig, which, as you remember, takes in a JSON object where each keys correspond to the column ID or column name. So for order number, it will be order number. And then within this property, we could specify the onClick, which will pass in row and column. And then let's say we want to just display what the user clicked. Just for example, well, can go ahead and do JSON stringify the row. So when the user clicks the order number is just going to show an alert message with the row. So if we save that, if the user were to click this, as you can see, it renders what the row value is. And you can use it for other things such as downloading a file based on what information comes from a row or a certain column. All of those things you can do within this onClick. So as you can see here, it doesn't look like it's clickable. So if you want to go ahead and change the styling, we just use the style prop. And then we can go ahead and borrow the style that it provides right here. So the color will be blue, cursor will be a pointer, and text decoration will be underlined. So if we go ahead and paste that, you'll see that the order number now looks like it's clickable. The other thing you can do is specify the rendered component. We can use what was provided in the example. So it was rendered component, which will pass in information such as the row and the column. And then what we need to return is what we will be replacing the value with. So if we go ahead and borrow this, this example, what it's gonna show is this, where we can completely replace the value. Rather than showing this, we can show a drop down instead, where if we hover over it, then we can add additional options like these. So let's say we want to download a certain row or trigger a different callback function. You can do that within this rendered component. Let's go ahead and move on to the next section, which is filtering. So the way filtering works is that given the rows of data within your grid, the user has an option to type whatever they're looking for within this search bar on the top right, which will get rendered if you set allowFiltering to true. And by default, it's set to false, of course. So if you, as the user is typing, it's dynamically searching all of the rows and it's going to filter it so that the user can find what they're looking for. So let's go ahead and do that. And all that's needed is allowFiltering to true. There you go. And now we have a search bar. So let's say we want to search for just Nguyen. You can do that. And it just dynamically searches for it as you're typing. Like that. Next one is grouping. So within all of the rows, you can group them together by similar value for a given column. So in this example, you can see that it's grouping it by the gender, and it's providing the value that it's grouping by. So let's go ahead and get that example. And all that's required is for you to set this allowGrouping property and set it to true. And then for grouping, to specify which column you want to group by. So for this example, it's doing it for product type. So let's say we have this original grid, and we want to go ahead and group it by order number. So all we need is allowGrouping, set it to true, and then we want to specify the grouping, which is by order number. And as you can see, it grouped it together based on this order number, and it provides you with the column name as well as the value it grouped by. And then all of the related rows are underneath there. So as you'll notice in the beginning, it shows up like this, where it's all compressed together. If we want to go ahead and have it so that all of them are expanded by default, all we need to do is use this property called expandGroupsByDefault and set it to true. So if we go ahead and expand groups by default and set it to true, if we save it, you'll see that as the grid renders, everything is already expanded. So another thing you can do is, let's say for some reason you don't want the column name as part of the grouping header, you can use this property called hideColumnNameInGrouping and just set it to true. So if we go ahead and do that, hideColumnNameInGrouping, what will happen is this order number will disappear right there. Another thing you can do is you can show the group count for a certain group. So for this example, this group should have a count of 2, and then this one should have a count of 1. So all we have to do is show group count and set it to true. And as you can see, now we know how many are getting displayed, how many rows are for that certain group. And the important thing to keep in mind while taking advantage of this grouping feature is that if you wanted to group all of your data internally properly, you want to provide all of the rows that is available. So don't use any sort of remote paging, and just within the rows property, provide all of the data possible so that this grid component can go ahead and group it for you more accurately. So that's how you use grouping. The other thing you can do is provide a summary, and all that's needed for that is allowSummarizing and set it to true. And then you also want to provide the summary items. So whichever column name you want to provide a summary for, as well as what kind of summary you want to provide. So you can provide the sum of all of the values for that column, or you can find the maximum or minimum, average, or count. So these are all of the options you have available. And you can also provide more than one type of summary for each column, as noted on here. So let's go ahead and do an example of this. So let's say you want to go ahead and summarize the balance for all of these people. What you want to do is we want to allow summarizing and set it to true. And then we want to provide the summary items. And if we take a look, summary items is an array of JSON objects with the column and the type as the properties for each JSON object. So we go ahead and create an array, and we want to provide the column name of balance. And then let's say for balance, we want to get the sum of all of the balances. So as you can see here, it does the calculation for us, and it provides the summary right here. You can do the same thing for the maximum. It's going to find the maximum, minimum, average, or you can do count as well. Yeah. And like I mentioned earlier, you can provide more than one summary per column. So let's say balance, we want to get both the sum and we want to provide the maximum as well. You can see it just stacks on top of each other. And you should be able to do even 3. So that's how you can summarize. There are also additional configurations you can do. So let's say you want to replace the labels. So instead of saying sum, which you can see right here, let's say we want to say total. All we have to do is use the property called summaryItemLabels, where it is a JSON object, and each of the property names, or each of the property is whatever you want to replace, whatever type name you want to replace the label for. So this example, sum now replaced with total. So let's say we go ahead and do that. Summary item labels. And we want to replace the sum with total. Now, as you can see here, instead of saying sum, it's total now. Let's say we also want to replace max and say max balance. You can see it shows up as well. And you can mitigate this issue right here by just expanding the column widths for balance. So you just change it to 120 now. Or 1. Just so it shows up. We want to do the average as well. Yeah. So that's how you can take advantage of that summaryItems labels. What you can also do is, rather than using the internal calculations, you can also provide your own custom summaries. And all it is just an array of numeric values for whatever you want to replace the summary for. So in our example, let's say I don't want to show 882. I want to show something completely different. Then I can go ahead and do custom summaries, which, if you remember, is an array of numeric values. So let's say I want to just show 10 arbitrarily. You can replace it completely, and you can replace all of these values. And this comes in handy if you ever need to provide a summary, but you want to go ahead and calculate it externally. You just use this customer summaries. Go on to the next section, which is selecting. So when it comes to selecting, you need to just enable this allowSelections and set it to true. And then you need to provide these 3 required properties, which is the selections and changeSelections. Selections is what the users have selected, and it's going to be shared between the parent and the grid component, just so they both know what the user selected. And changeSelections just alters this value right here. So let's say we want to go ahead and implement this. We want to allow selections and set it to true. And we want to keep track of all the selections. And then changeSelections, which will provide us with all the selection the user made so far. And then we just want to change this value directly every time. We want selections or set state, previous state. So now every time that the user changes their selections, this callback is going to get called, pass in what the user selected, and then within the parent component, which is where we are right now, it's just going to provide us this information, and we just want to go ahead and save that so that the selections will also have that same value, so that both the parent and this grid component have the same values. If we save it, now we have access to all of the selections. In terms of these selections, as you can see, it's mainly just passing the selections from the grid component to the parent and then back to the grid component. If we want to just take advantage of the selections and know what those are, then you already have access to it here. Let's say you want to make an API call and use those selections to generate some report based on the selections. Then you can just have access to it just inside of here. So selections, you can just call state selections and then do whatever API call you need to make. And all of these states, that selections will always be up to date based on what the user selected. So that's how you use those selections. As you can see here, we don't have an option to select all. If we want to do that, there is a feature called showSelectAll. And by setting that to true, we'll finally see that checkbox. So showSelectAll, set to true. Now we can select all of the rows at one time. Another thing you can do is select by row click. By default, it is set to false. So as you can see, if I click on a row, it doesn't actually let me select it, but select by row click. Set it to true. Now we can select just by clicking the row. Now there are reasons why you won't want to do this. So if you set it to true, you actually can't copy it because as you can see, as I'm trying to copy this data, it unselects it. And that doesn't give the users an ability to copy the data. So by default, it is set to false, but if for some reason you want to allow them to do a row click, then you can do that using the select by row click. The next one is data modifications, which is a big one. So for data modifications, it goes by 3 parts. Either you create data, you edit a data, either by a whole row or a table cell, or you delete the data. So we'll start off with creating. So all that's required for creating is setting this allowCreating to true. And then we want to also provide the onCommitChanges, which will get called every time that the user clicks save on the creation that they make. So let's go ahead and do an example of this. allowCreating is true. And then onCommitChanges. It's a callback function that will provide us whichever the user added. And we want to just go ahead and use this added. So if we want to save it through an API call, we can do that. Or as provided in the example, it's going to revise the rows locally and add it to that rows array. So we have this added. And it's taking the current state of the rows and it recreates that. And all it's doing is it's just appending this new thing that we added into the new version of the rows and then setting it back to the state. So as you can see here, there's a new column now where it says it allows us to click it and create new rows. So if we click this, as you can see now we can add a new row for this table. So let's say when I go ahead and do 1011, just do my name, age, and if we just leave it like that for now, we go ahead and save. It will call this onCommitChanges. As you can see inside the added, it has the object where the user's input gets saved onto. And we're gonna just revise this rows, which is what it already exists. We're just gonna revise it to append this new added that we just created. Or perhaps append is not the right word, but push. So push. So now if we push it through, there you go. So now the rows will get replaced with our new version of rows, which should have this new thing we created. And now it gets added onto that into this grid locally. So that's how you go about creating. The next step is, let's say we want to just allow the users to create only under certain columns. So right now, the user, when they click new, it allows them to create out of all of these columns. And as you can see, it's just a text. Even an insert date is a text. But let's say I want to make the date columns into an actual date picker, or I want to make balance into a currency. All that's needed is to take advantage of this property called editConfig and provide this fields property, which is a JSON object with keys matching the column's name property. And for each field, you provide the type, which can either be a text, a number, currency, Boolean, and even drop downs you can provide, and ultimately the date. And there's additional guidance on here in terms of like for things like the drop down, where it can be both an asynchronous drop down or it can be a drop down that you already provide values for by default. That's hard coded. And you can see a better example right here. So you can have a name that's a type text. You have quantity, which is a type number. So if the user tries to type some letters, it's not going to accept it, nor will it accept any symbols. Currency, as you can see right here, it's a number only field, but it allows for only 2 decimal places. It's also type Boolean, or you can provide a drop down, or maybe if you want the drop down to be asynchronous, you can also specify like this, where this is a hook callback, and ultimately the date. So let's go ahead and see an example of this. So let's say we want to just allow the user to specify the name, the age, insert date, update date, and balance, and we want to exclude the user ID. All we have to do is editConfig, which is an object. We want to specify the fields, which is also an object. And for each fields, we just want to reference which columns we want to be able to edit. So the name column, we'll just give it a type of text. For age, we just want that to be a type number. Insert date, we want that to be a type date. And then same thing goes for update date. And then lastly, balance, which we'll make into a currency. If we go ahead and save this, and we try to create a new row, you'll see that user ID is blocked off because we didn't even specify as part of the fields. So if you don't want the user to revise that field, then just don't specify here. So now if we type in the name, we can type in a text because we specified the type to be a text. Age, we specified to a number. So if I try to type in any letters, it's not going to accept it, nor will it accept any symbols I type. Only numeric values I can type. And even if I try to do it afterwards, it won't do it. So that's how you can restrict that to a number. Insert date, we specified as date. To insert and update date, we specified as the date. So now if we click it, it's a date picker. So let's say if we want to insert date is today, update date, some other value, you have this date picker available for you. And then for balance, so balance is similar to numeric. We type numeric values, and then we type in a period. It only allows me to type 2 other decimal places. And I can also just do 1, or I don't do anything at all. But if I try to type in any other letters, it doesn't let me. And now if we click save, you can see it's much better, where the insert date and update date, the data that I provided is coming off of whatever I typed in or whatever the date picker helped me select. So that's how you can take advantage of this fields configuration, editConfig fields, and specify certain types so that the input fields are of a certain type to help your users pick the correct data. So when it comes to editing, you just need to select allow editing and set it to true. And then the onCommitChanges, so same thing. You just need to provide that same callback. And instead of providing added, it's going to be changed. And then within this change, then you just change whatever the rows is. The local, in the example, it's changing the rows locally. And then again, you have this editConfig, which you can specify the fields again. But on top of that, there can be times where you don't want the user to revise a whole row, but to just revise a certain table cell. So if we want to go ahead and implement that, let's go ahead and replace this allowCreating to allowEditing and set it to true. So what's going to happen now is if I save it, now instead of a create, it's going to have an edit option on the left side of each row. And if I click it, I can edit the information for that given row. And as you recall, in the commit changes, it's going to provide me changed instead of added. And instead of appending or pushing this new row we created, we want to revise an existing one. And we can just go ahead and borrow this code sample right here. So as you can see, changed, it's providing whatever I changed. So I changed the name, I changed the age, the insert and update date. So those are part of this changed object. And it's going to pass it inside of here. And then you just manipulate it with whatever you want. So if you want to make an API call to change the row, you can do that. Just place a callback function. Or if you want to just change it locally, then you can use this sample code. So within this sample code, what it's going to do is it's going to recreate the rows again. And then it's going to see, did I change anything? Is the change object, does it have any values? And if it does, then we'll go ahead and replace it. So within this new rows, which is the copy of the rows, we want to just go ahead and access the index. So whatever the index of the rows that the user changed. So in this instance, it should be 0. And then it's just gonna recreate a new object with the old version. And then we want to just add the whatever we changed, which is going to be the name, the insert, update, and age. So now new rows will be the new version, which has our changes, as you can see right here. The other thing you can do is rather than having them edit on a whole row, you can have them edit on a table cell basis. So if you want to do that for table cells, you use this property called editFormat. And it can either be this cell or a row. And by default, it's using row. So if we want to do cell, what it's going to do is it's going to highlight the table cell that is editable. And then whenever the user is in edit mode, they can see this update or cancel button, very similar to how it is in our application right now. So let's go ahead and do this. So edit format. We want to do cell. And let's say that we only want to update the balance. So let's go ahead and get rid of all of these and save. Now, as you can see, the edit column goes away since we don't want them to revise the whole row. And now only balance gets highlighted and we can edit the table cell. So if we double click, we can actually go ahead and type in a new value. And then we can either click update or cancel. If we cancel, it's just going to disregard it. But if we go ahead and update, it's going to go ahead and save it. So that's how you do the table cell editing feature. Now, there are other options available as well when it comes to edit format cell. If for some reason you want to select the text on edit start, you can set that to true so that whatever the whole text is that the user clicks on, it's going to select it so that it's ready to be replaced completely. But by default, set to false so that the user can just append to the end of it. So like you can see right here, it doesn't select it. But if I did turn it on, then it will select this whole thing. I can just append to it. The other option I have is startEditAction. So if I want to change it so that if the user does one click and it's available for editing, I can do that. But by default, it's set to double click, just so that we don't trigger the users to mistakenly edit it by a simple click. But that option is available. So if we do click, then a simple click triggers it. But if I don't provide that, then I have to double click. So those options are available for you guys. But the other thing I haven't mentioned yet is you can also specify fields height. So if for some reason you want it to be larger, like all of these input fields to be taller, you can edit those. So fields height, let's say we want, or maybe we want to make it smaller for some reason. Let's do 15. So if it goes on edit mode, you see how it's smaller, that's gonna happen. That's gonna render for you if you want it for some reason to be smaller. So you're gonna get smaller. Let's say we want to make it bigger. As you can see, it got taller. But by default, this field's height is going to be to 20px. So those are all the features for editing and editing between the whole row or a cell. Next step is deleting. So if we want to allow the user to delete rows, then all we need to do is specify this allowDeleting and set it to true. And then onCommitChanges again. So we go ahead and go back, allowDeleting, set it to true. Now the user can see an option to delete. And then, of course, on onCommitChanges, we'll get the deleted. And then we just will need to change how it's changing it locally for the rows. So in the example, all it's doing is it's gonna try to recreate this rows object using the existing rows state. And then it's gonna omit anything that references this index that we have that we're trying to delete. So let's go ahead and copy this over. What's gonna happen is once we delete something, it's just gonna erase it from the grid locally. So that's how you do deleting. Now there are two other options when it comes to deleting. If for some reason you want to show a delete confirmation, you can do that using this show delete confirmation. Just set it to true. So delete confirmation true. A pop-up will show up. And then if the user clicks yes, it goes ahead and deletes it. But if the user clicks no, then it just keeps it the same. You can also override the delete confirmation message. So are you sure you want to delete this data or this row? And then it's going to replace that message. That's for data modifications. The other things you guys can do is for paging and sorting. So for paging, there's two different configurations. You can either do a local paging, or you guys can do remote paging. So for local paging, all that's required is to set this show paging panel to true. And by default, it is set to true. So let's say, let's go ahead and get rid of this examples right here. And refresh. So since it says 10, let's go ahead and just make more dummy data. And just duplicate these guys, just so that we can show this paging feature. So now we have 12. Now you can see right here that we have the paging feature available where all 12 of our data we can page through, and it does it locally. And if we want to expand the page sizes, that option is available as well, so we can just show more data. But now let's say we want to enable remote paging. To do this, besides showing the paging panel, we want to provide things such as the allow remote paging, and then these other properties, so that so for instance, whatever the current page the user selects, and then a handler to change that value, whatever the page size is, and then a handler to change that page size, as well as the total count. And total count is from the database, whatever the total number of rows that the grid component will page through. You just need to provide that value to the grid component so that it knows how to calculate all of these, how many pages to show. So let's see an example from the search form component. As you can see right here, all that's needed besides the show paging panel, which is set to true by default, we want to provide the allow paging and set it to true. We want to provide whatever the current page is. So the current page changes every time that the grid component's callback change current page gets called. So if we look through that function, it passes in the current page, and then we just want to set whatever the parent component's version or value of current page is. And then that's just going to get sent back to current page. So it just has that back and forth. It's just that now the parent component has that same information that the grid component will render. Same thing goes for page size as well. So anytime we trigger the page size to change, this page size variable will just change right there. And then, of course, the total count, whatever the search results or whatever the grid's total count is for all of the rows, then you just need to provide that information. So with all of this set up, an example for you guys to take advantage for the current page information. So as you can see right here, whenever the user clicks a different current page or a different page size, it's gonna call this callback to re-perform the search, or it can be whatever asynchronous API call you need to make. And what it does is it takes in whatever that current page is and current page size, and it sends it as part of the API call. So it provides whatever the current page is, whatever the start is, which is whatever the page size that the user is looking at, as well as the current page, and then the limit. And then after it makes the API call, it will provide us the total count as well. So in this example, after it gets the search results, it's gonna save those search results as part of the rows, as well as the total. And these get sent back to the grid component. So you just need to have that consistency to maintain this remote paging feature. And you guys can look over these for additional guidance. But the other thing you guys can take advantage of is this page sizes. So page sizes by default is going to show 10, 50, 100. But if you want to show different option values, you can do 25, 50. It's just an array of numeric values. So you can see right there, 10, 50, 100. If I want to change it to page sizes, I want to change it to 25, 50, 100. Then I can change that over. And that's mainly used for remote paging. The other thing you can do is if you want to, for some reason, hide the paging panel, so no paging feature whatsoever, nor any page size, then you just need to set show paging panel to false. and by default it's set to true, and it's going to hide that bottom. So in terms of sorting, for local sorting, all that's required is to set this allow sorting to true. So let's say we want to go ahead and sort. So as you can see, if I hover over the column names, I'm not able to sort it at all. But if I allow sorting, then now I can sort through them. Now, if you want to do remote sorting, so whenever the user clicks one of these columns, we want to trigger an API call to tell the backend what the selected sorting is, then you need to provide this allow sorting, a remote sorting property, and set it to true. And then you just need to provide the sorting itself that you want, or that the grid component provides as what the user selected, and then change sorting. So it's very similar idea to how page size and change page sizes. You just need to provide for sorting whatever the change sorting provides you. So you're just passing it back and forth. So let's go ahead and add that in. Allow remote sorting, set it to true. We want to provide the sorting, and then change sorting, which will just provide us with the sorting that the user selected. And then we just want to save it back as part of the sorting like previously. Like that. But if we look at an example, the way it works with the search component, a search form component, is that it has this, so it's the same idea as this, where change sorting will provide us the sorting that the user selected, and then you just save it to the state. After it saves it, it just passes it back. So as you can see right here, sorting, change sorting, it's going to provide us the sorting, and then you can, based on every change in the sorting, you can go ahead and initialize a search or an API call based on whatever the user selected for sorting. But then you also just want to go ahead and pass that back to the grid component so that you can render the sorting arrow like this. The search grid sorting, as you can see, it goes back to the grid component. So those are what are required for remote sorting. The other thing you can also do is, for some reason, you want to sort by a certain algorithm that you want. So for example, the date, you want to sort the date properly instead of just sorting it by string. You can specify this column sorting property. And within this column sorting property, here's an example. It is an object where you provide the column name where this custom algorithm will be used, will be targeted against whenever the user sorts it. And then just provide a compare function where it takes in the A and B, or just two parameters, and then just compares them based on however you want to compare them. And then you just return -1, 0, or 1, depending on if it's less than, equal, or greater than. But by default, this is just an example for sorting the dates, but if you provide the type date in the columns, like this, type date for the columns property, then it'll do this sorting for you. So you don't have to provide this column sorting. This only is used if you want to sort it a different way that you want, a custom way, using an algorithm. So that's how you do sorting. Now we're almost done. The other features you can take advantage of is showing some refresh button, export button, or showing even the total count. So for refreshing, by default it's set to false, but you can show a refresh button by just setting allow refreshing to true, and then just provide a callback function to the refresh data. So as you can see right here in this example, I set allow refreshing to true, and then the callback function makes an API call to retrieve this grid data, and then it saves it back to the rows. So how does this refresh button looks? Let's go ahead and get rid of the sorting. And allow refreshing and set it to true. And then refresh data, just to show you guys that it does trigger it. You can go ahead and just show an alert message to say refresh data. So since we set it to true, you can see that the refresh button is added on the bottom left. And whenever we click it, it's going to call whatever a callback function is. So the same idea goes for exporting. You just set allow exporting to true, and then you provide a callback function for the export data. And as you can see in this example, it just makes an API call to export whatever the list is for those rows. And then it just downloads, shows a download prompt based on whatever the file that the backend generates. So if we go ahead and allow exporting, export data, provide another callback function. You'll see that this export button is now shows up right here, and it calls our callback function. The last one is for the total count. So by default, it's set to true whenever the refresh or the export button appears, but you can show you can hide it altogether. So as you can see, when I added the refresh, this total suddenly showed up like that. But if we want to go ahead and hide it, we can just set it to false, and it's going to get hidden. The other thing you can do is for customization, the buttons themselves for a refresh and export, you can just hide them. By default, they're set to true, but you can hide them so that it simplifies it, so that it just looks, it just shows the symbols. If we want the grid to look more compact, so show labels, button labels, you can set it to false. It just hides them, so it just looks like this. So in terms of customizing the grid, specify a max height and a max width. So max height is just this max height, max grid height, like this. So let's say I don't want it to be too tall like this, then we can do max grid height, and we can set it to, let's say, 25 view height. What will happen is it shrinks the grid, and it shows a scroll bar if it's too tall. Same thing goes for max grid width. Say I just want to make it more compressed, then it shrinks the grid, and then it adds those scroll bars. So those are all the properties that you guys can take advantage of when it comes to the grid component.